Hi, welcome to the show. As you can see, it is Tuesday once again, and Eric Peters is my guest. Eric, great to catch up with you as always. I think the hardest thing that you and I face on a weekly basis is knowing where to start with all the rich topics to explore.
Yep. Isn't it something, you and I have been in the media a long time or working as journalists for a very long time. And I can remember what they used to call slow news days when there just wasn't that much going on. And sometimes it would be a slow news week or even a slow news month. Now, it's coming at us staccato style, like a machine gun burst of one crisis after another. And I think, to an extent, that may be deliberate because it keeps us all off balance. It's very difficult to sit and process what's going on with regard to a given crisis when there's another crisis that gets dropped in your lap. So let's see, we're on potentially the verge of a major war in the Middle East. There's another war that could potentially erupt at any time in Eastern Europe. There's that.
Mexico's not looking so great right now.
It's not looking so great in Mexico either. I enjoyed the bandana before we got on the air. I know, I have some relatives that live in Mexico, and I'm glad I didn't decide to pay a visit to them recently.
Holy cow. I mean, look, I I'm a big non-interventionist. A few years of exposure to Ron Paul, and I was firmly on the path of we really should be minding our own business and fixing our own problems first before we go imposing our goodness on, on other people. But wow, that the capture and then ultimately the killing of the head of the Jalisco New Generation cartel it shows you just how fragile the hold on power really is. And I think it also illustrates that when it comes to protecting yourself, you really are on your own, regardless of what politicians' words on paper may say.
Well, absolutely. There's another aspect of this that interests me too. You and I are old enough to remember the term ugly American. Remember that one?
Oh, yeah.
And now we are caught generally, I'm just speaking generally here, in this horrible position of wanting nothing to do with a lot of what's going on. I didn't authorize this. I don't sanction it. I don't like it. And yet it's being done in the name of all Americans. And the result of this is that Americans are becoming a kind of pariah class of people around the world, which for that reason makes it a prudent thing to not go to these other countries where the people understandably are coming to loathe us. And when somebody loathes you, sometimes you can expect to get cold cocked sometimes or worse. So it's awful that we're all being put in this position. That's my take on that.
I have a deep concern about the amount of flexing and chest beating. And look, I'm not trying to take away anybody's happiness that the U.S. hockey team won at the Olympics, but Cash Patel, slamming beers with them, and just there comes a point where I have to ask, is this the pride that comes before a fall? Because we're pretty fond of ourselves, in a general sense.
Yeah, there's decorum. This is a high government official. He's the head of the FBI, and the behavior was frat boy like, totally inappropriate. It would have been fine if he'd called the team up and said, "Hey, congratulations, you guys did a great job. Really enjoyed watching you play." But guzzling champagne with them and putting the medal around his neck, it's infantile. Again, it just speaks to the way we are perceived. And I'm not expecting that people should worship our government or federal authority. The point is, when it comes into ridicule, you begin to have ridiculous government, and we're at that point now. We've got the president of the United States. I just looked at his website where he's pitching watches, victory watches. It's vulgar, it's crass, it's inappropriate. You can just imagine going back to the founding. Can you imagine Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, who was the apogee of propriety, behaving in a manner like Cash Patel? It's inconceivable.
Well, and I think the big disconnect and the reason that much of the American public is likely to shrug. Oh, well, that's it's we're winning, and that's how you show you're winning. If anybody has taken the time to go back and read the actual writings of George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or any of the founders for that matter, I'm not saying that they were walking around with this grim-faced dour attitude, but they were serious individuals in the right ways. And
Yep.
especially those who were in positions of leadership, uh, they conducted themselves as adults, and I think we're missing something like that today.
I think you touch on something very important. Vladimir Putin, whatever you may think about Vladimir Putin, would never behave in that way. He's a serious man, and he's respected for being a serious man. Respect doesn't mean you necessarily like him or approve of him. It means there goes a man. There is somebody worth being respected. Unfortunately, the people that are running this government are doing exactly the opposite. They're behaving like 60, 70, even almost 80-year-old junior high school kids, jumping around. And I mean, I really think it's not inconceivable at this point that Trump might, lay on his back and pull up his legs and light a fart before the press corps. Would you be surprised if he did that?
You
Look, smell
know,
the beautiful aroma. I make the biggest farts. Nobody's farts are better than my farts.
I don't know if it could be branded and sold. There's a
Sure.
possibility, but yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned Putin, and I think of one of the people who is being piled on right now for merely having talked to Putin, Tucker Carlson. Now,
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting everybody ought to be a big Tucker Carlson fan, but you caught his interview with U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, right?
Yeah. He's that rare thing, a journalist. He actually goes to look at the source and talk to the source. There's this weird idea that if a journalist talks to a politician or a political figure, that somehow that means he approves of him, that he's aiding and abetting this person. It's
He's a
ridiculous.
puppet.
I mean, there's a famous writer, William Shirer, who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and he was a foreign correspondent that lived in Berlin before the war, and he regularly went to press conferences, interviewed Hitler and Goebbels and other high Nazi officials, and wrote about that because that's what a journalist does. He was covering the story. Well, Tucker covers the story. He went to go interview Putin because the man is the leader of Russia. He's a consequential individual. It's relevant. We would like to know what this man is thinking and ask him questions. Well, you and I can't do it. Tucker was in a position to do it. The same with regard to Huckabee, and he asked Huckabee some very, very pointed questions, and Huckabee came off looking deranged, out of his senses. Somebody who doesn't see basic facts, who is just willingly obtuse. And I thank Tucker for doing it, particularly at this juncture, because it seems that we are standing on the precipice of a completely unwanted war in that part of the world. Americans don't want this to happen. They don't see that they have any interest in attacking Iran, and yet it seems to proceed apace. And I think that Tucker's pointed questioning of Huckabee made it very clear why this war is about to happen.
Well, and Huckabee gave an answer to a question, and I really believe Tucker was not trying to, gotcha, hit him with some kind of question to box him in there, but he asked him, well, based on what you're saying about Israel has a right to this, and it's biblical. Go back to this verse or this chapter and this verse in Genesis, and he says, what's the extent of that? Because it sounds very much like if you go off of I think it was Genesis 15, it sounds like the Abrahamic promise was that Israel could have everything from the Euphrates to the Nile, and he says that's much of the Middle East, far beyond just the nation of Israel as we know it today. And their conversation continued, and then Huckabee said something kind of out of frustration, but he may have slipped and inadvertently said the truth of what he was thinking, and he said we'd be fine if they took it all,
Sure.
which probably set diplomacy in the Middle East back at least a couple of decades.
Yeah, and there's an interesting parallel here. I love to bring up these historical things because I think they're relevant. They show us things. One of the great outrages committed by the National Socialists who ran Germany was this idea of Lebensraum, of Greater Germany, that it wasn't enough for Germany to have the land that constituted Germany. They had to expand the Reich. The Greater German Reich was the formal name for it. Well, looky here, what's going on over there. They literally are talking about Greater Israel. They're actually using the same exact terminology and they're employing the same tactics. They're just constantly pushing and pushing and pushing. The reason that World War II started is because the Germans kept pushing. They kept taking more and more land, pushing and pushing, pushing beyond what was traditionally understood to be Germany into other people's lands. And finally, the match lit the gasoline and boom, it went off. And that seems to be exactly the case here. The effronterousness of it is absolutely mind blowing.
What's interesting too, and more than just a little disturbing, is the number of religious publications, and I'm going to lean, primarily evangelical religious publications that are falling all over themselves to denounce Tucker and to run interference for Huckabee, rather than letting the reader kind of come to their own conclusion. I mean, the same insane spin that we saw during COVID from the mainstream media, I see that degree of spin coming from the evangelical press, regarding Israel. It's
I see it
disturbing.
also. It's disturbing, and I find it particularly disturbing because what it is evil being done in the name of good. I know a number of evangelical Christians who have that attitude, and in their mind, they believe that they are acting and speaking in biblically correct ways in defense of Israel, which they equate with the people discussed in the Bible. There's some parallel between that and the people who are now going to that land, and they're not necessarily the same thing. But in their mind, they're not just like vicious, awful people. Most of the Nazis weren't vicious, awful people. The rank and file who supported Hitler, they thought, we're doing the right thing for our people and for our nation. We are, they had belt buckles that said Gott mit uns, God with us. This is the thing. It's a key thing for people to understand. Most people are not consciously evil, but they do evil because they think they're doing it in the name of good. COVID being another example of that.
Yep. And I only mention this. I know people you mention the word Israel and immediately people are on hair trigger alert. Oh, here comes something anti-Semitic, unless I'm, fawning all over the government of Israel. But um, this is why it's so important. You've got to think for yourself. You've got to be willing to question the narrative, and there is definitely a narrative to which we're supposed to be confined as to what can be said and what can be questioned and what is absolutely off limits, lest you be canceled. And it's not through actual law. It's through it's more through an agreement, or kind of a consensus that, well, if someone says this, then we label them anti-Semitic, and they're subject to cancellation.
Yeah, there's this immense psychological pressure that is something that is unique to modern times because we have modern media, which is able to form consensus. So just like during COVID, if you raised your hand and said, well, wait a minute, I don't see how standing 6 feet apart and putting on a dust mask is going to do anything of any good regarding, the stopping the spread. Well, you obviously want to kill grandma. You're an awful person. You have mask aversion syndrome or whatever the heck it was. Same thing now. I despise people who cloak themselves in religion and race and then use that to shut you up. You're not allowed to ask certain questions because if you do that, then you're a racist, or you don't like somebody because they're Jewish. Netanyahu is a Jew only in nominal terms. He doesn't practice Judaism, and his family comes from Eastern Europe. So if you question, what he is doing with regard to what's going on in Gaza, somehow, you're an anti-Semite implicitly. You hate Jews. You want to put Jews in the oven. No, I don't. And the fact is, Netanyahu's not even Semitic. He's Eastern European. So I've got an Eastern European accusing me of hating Jews who's not even a Semite. It's just so Looney Tunes if it weren't so catastrophic in its implications that it's just almost impossible to get your head around it.
So, how do we find ourselves as a nation poised to launch what could very well be a very large scale war in the Middle East on behalf of a tiny little nation that we're assured there's nothing going on here, but it seems to be exercising outsized control of our own government?
Yeah, you raise a really good point. I wrote about this the other day because I'm so annoyed by it. And the article was titled "Has Israel Jumped the Shark?" And Gen X people and older will remember that. It's a reference to the show Happy Days and the Fonz. And it was a very popular show for a long time. And then there was this episode where Fonzie water skied wearing his motorcycle jacket over a shark. And after that point, the show became ridiculous and nobody wanted to watch it anymore, and it failed. And I think the same situation is developing now with regard to Israel. This is so over the top, so obviously contrary to what the American people have expressed and what they want, which is to not go to war. They don't want this war overwhelmingly. Every poll that I have seen is in the high 60s against. So why are we doing it? Well, my point is the Israeli government is making the case for the Israeli government having operative control over the government of the United
Hang on
States.
1 second here. All right. My dogs have alerted, whatever it
Oh,
is, they're okay now.
but they apparently, in their arrogance, don't see that what they are doing is confirming stereotypes, confirming the argument that the Israeli government, through its appendages such as AIPAC, has acquired operative control over the policy of the federal government of the United States, which is clearly not acting in a manner that's consistent with the U.S. interests. This war is very obviously, if it's going to happen, in the interests of the state of Israel, and that's fine. Israel has its own interests. I don't, they have a right to pursue what they consider to be their interests. But the thing is, they're dragging us along as their proxy to make us act in their interests. And that, in the end, is going to not go well for them. I think all the sympathy, all of the goodwill that state has enjoyed for decades since its founding in 1948 is being absolutely frittered away by what's going on right now.
That was beautifully stated. And for people who hear that and think, well, there he is, Eric's just being anti-Semitic, I would ask you, look in the mirror and examine your own motives. Are you really, are you looking at this through tunnel vision, which I think we're expected to, at least on behalf of the press and most political platforms. But we've got to see the bigger picture. And I love, by the way, the article about jumping the shark, because it's such an apt metaphor for not just what Israel's doing, but so much of what's happening, politically today.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's important to ask questions. When you hear somebody being accused of anti-Semitism, Tucker's a fine example of it. Well, look into what the man says and look into what the man does. Has he ever done anything to your knowledge that indicates that he doesn't like people who are Jewish just because they're Jewish? I don't see anything that suggests that. In fact, quite the opposite. He, like me and like you and like a number of other people who are uncomfortable with what the state of Israel is doing, have gone to great lengths to be very careful to say, I've got nothing against a man who happens to be Jewish or Jewish people as such. I have something against people who behave and act in a certain manner, whether they happen to be Jewish or not. That's an important distinction to make. It's the same distinction that we ought to make with regard to everything else, whether it's COVID, whether it's race relations, all of that. Let's closely look at what people are saying and not allow ourselves to be swayed by people who want us to impugn the motives, not the facts, but their motives are nefarious.
And I think that part of the way that you address that is you make people define their terms. So when someone says, well, that person's an anti-Semite, define for me, what is it that they've said that meets that? What do you mean by anti-Semitic? And the reason that you do this is not to play gotcha, but I think it's the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. They have a definition of what constitutes anti-Semitism. And I'm paraphrasing this, but the best explanation I've heard of it is basically it's anything someone says that could be construed in a negative way or cause negative feelings toward the Jewish people.
Yep.
Now they're using the term Jewish people as a stand-in for the Israeli government, but basically, if you say something that could be construed as, "Hey, that you shouldn't notice that," or if you do notice it, you shouldn't say something about it. It seems to me like this is a way of policing language preemptively, at least casting doubt so people don't know what they can say safely without being accused. And unfortunately, the accusation seems to carry the weight of a conviction.
Oh, absolutely. And that kind of thing is already manifesting in places like Florida, where cops have been going to people's houses because they posted something on social media that was sympathetic toward the Palestinians, the Gazans, and critical of the state of Israel. I mean, that even though there is not as yet any legal means to prosecute somebody criminally, that's the bearing of the fangs. That's sending a message. That's next. And it's very clear, I think Netanyahu himself and certainly some other people have openly said that they would like to see criminal prosecutions of people who criticize anything the state of Israel does as being anti-Semitic, i.e., anti-Jewish, and therefore you favor pogroms.
Yep, that's quite a leap, but but there we are. That's the way it's being done. Um, I don't know if you saw. Did you see James Howard Kunstler's latest article about the campaign of bad faith and ill will
I don't
that's
think I
playing
did.
out?
I haven't. What
This
did
one,
he have to say?
I think this one landed in my email inbox yesterday, but it's another great illustration of do unto others before they can do unto you. And I think he has a video there of Susan Rice, who I believe was one of Obama's big advisors. I think she also was instrumental in the Biden administration. But she's making a promise. I mean, maybe it's a threat. Basically, it's when we get back in power, we are going to hold all of you accountable. And she doesn't just
Mhm.
mean members of the Trump administration. She means any of the people who considered themselves Trump supporters or who voted for him.
Yeah.
They are going to be held accountable. What do you suppose that means?
Well, I think so. The wind reaped the whirlwind. I think it's evident to any thinking person that if the left does acquire power again, that is exactly what's going to happen. We're going to see something like J6 on steroids. It won't be just people who went to a Trump rally. It will be anybody who has in any way done anything to indicate that they support Trump, which means you and me, because at one point I've supported things that he's done. I've said favorable things about him in the past. And you can bet your bippy they're going to come after us. And the thing that's just so infuriating is that it is Trump that is setting the ground for all of this by his actions. The gratuitous things that he does, the personal insults that he hurls out, the callousness of his actions. it is causing people to become extraordinarily angry. And it's also causing people who are on our side to just sort of go, oh my God, I can't be associated with this. I'm not even going to participate. I'm not going to vote anymore because I don't want to be any part of this. I'm tired of being Charlie Brown kicking the football. And so there's going to be this backlash. I see this coming. It happened in my state. We got a landslide victory for Abigail Spanberger. And I foresee that if things continue in the direction that they're headed right now, come 2026, well, here we are, come the midterms, which are what, 9, 10 months away from us now, there's going to be a massive sweep. The Democrats are going to take both houses. They're going to then go after Trump. At minimum, he'll be stymied for the remainder of his term. And then come 2028, God only knows what we're going to get. Maybe we'll get President Spanberger or President Newsom. And what do you think they're going to do? If they end up controlling the federal government at all three levels, they'll pack the Supreme Court. We'll be in a forever dictatorship of the radical left. That's it. It's game over. And if that happens, it will be because Trump frittered away all the political capital and all the goodwill that he had after getting back in office again. That's my opinion on that.
By the way, did I hear correctly that Spanberger is going to be delivering the Democratic response to the State of the
Yes.
Union?
Yes.
What's the reasoning behind that?
Right, because they're promoting her. They see her as an up and comer. She's sort of a younger Hillary Clinton. She's in a position in terms of both her age and otherwise. I mean, she won a decisive victory in a very important state, Virginia, politically at the national level. Why not? Who better? Maybe Spanberger and what's his name, the governor of Pennsylvania, Shapiro, right?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody like that, or Newsom. I don't know. Newsom's not really. He's so greasy, and I think the Dems are probably smart enough to not bring him forward. But Shapiro presents well. Spanberger presents well. There you go. I think that they would potentially absolutely sweep the next presidential election based on the way things are going right now, and we know what her politics are. So bye bye Second Amendment. Bye bye lots of other things. Bye bye free speech. Bye bye saying anything anti-Semitic. It's over at that point.
Kind of a good argument to get your ducks in a row and be
Oh, I
as
know. That's why I
self-sufficient as
decided.
you possibly
It's not like I
can.
can afford to do this Trans Am transformation that you and I have been talking about a little bit.
Speaking
But
of which,
hmm?
since we're coming up on the end of the segment here,
Oh yeah,
but talk to me about your project. How is your Trans Am coming along?
it's nearly finished. Everything now is done. I'm awaiting the shift linkage in order to be able to install the transmission, but that's it. It's almost completely done at this point. So if the linkage arrives later this week, and if I have time this weekend, I could potentially have it running in about 10 days from now, I hope.
All right. I'm going to be watching your website, ericpetersautos.com, because I know you've been posting updates. Is there anything else automotive that we should mention before we go today?
Well, it's a long subject, but I came across some very interesting data about the effect that Trump's tariffs have had specifically on the car business, which of course is my field. And they claim figures ranging from $3,000 to $4,000 on average have been added to the price of a new car over just the last 10 months as a result of Trump's tariffs, which are effectively taxes. That's the thing that Americans should understand. Now, I understand that the motive of it is, well, we're gonna kind of equal the playing field, and we're going to encourage people to manufacture things in this country, and that's fine as far as it goes. The problem is that Trump has done absolutely nothing to address the regulatory compliance costs that make manufacturing things in this country expensive. That's why they're being manufactured elsewhere. So I don't see how it does Americans any good to manufacture more expensive things here. I mean, great. They say made in America, lovely. They still cost, a fortune. You can't afford to buy them. So it doesn't work. That's my, brief synopsis of that point.
All right. Eric, great as always to visit with you. Hang in there. Things
You
are only
too.
going to get more exciting as we go
Yep.
forward, I'm sure.
Yep.
We'll catch up again next Tuesday.
That's great. Thank you, Migo.